So I'm your friendly host, I'm Gareth, I'll be with you for the hour. We're going to discuss who's leading the agenda and who should be leading the agenda in the climate conversation. And so we're going to be asking really, so who does have influence over the messages that you and I and all of us receive? So is it governments, is it activists, is it activists on the M25 and blocking Heathrow Airport and so on? Is it the climate change deniers? Is the answer, well, it depends? That would be a more interesting answer. That'll give us more to talk about. But also, what the panel here will be able to do is to kind of not just answer that question, but kind of take us a little bit underneath. You know, why is that the case, that some messages get through and some don't? And what challenges do we face in this ongoing climate change conversation? I'm sure at some point we'll talk even about climate change fatigue, for instance, and what a barrier that is to communicating messages about climate change. So lots to get into. So I'll keep all the introductions as brief as I can, but a few things I'm duty-bound to go through with you because they're really important about COVID safety. As you can see on the panel here, we're not wearing face coverings, but we would still like you in the audience, ideally to keep your coverings on, and I see most of you do have your face masks on. We really appreciate it. If you're thinking, well, that's a bit hypocritical, why hasn't he got his on? But, you know, we are 1 metre separated, we're a nice long distance from you, so we're not doing you any harm, and we are doing this by the book. We're following all the regulations. So that's the message on that. When you're posing questions, and we want this to be interactive, by the way, because I'll just run out of questions, you see, so we need you to keep the conversation going. You'll come up to the microphone up here and pose your question, because we also have an online audience. So hello Internet, thanks for tuning in or streaming or whatever we call it these days. So hello Internet, we're glad you're there, and we're so glad you're there, we're going to make sure everybody's on mic so you can hear what's going on. If you are on watching it online, then somewhere I have my iPad, and I'll be keeping an eye on this, so your questions will come up on here. But if they're rude or abusive, they won't, because we have moderators, but I'm sure you're a lovely bunch out there. So that's all that set up, isn't it? So I think we should meet our panel and get on with things. So let me just see, and I'm actually going to start over with Katarina, because she's conveniently on that side of the stage. So Katarina von Brunsvig is a behavioural therapist and is particularly interested in climate change activism. And you're part of a movement, Katarina, called Psychologists for the Future. So just in a few words, just tell us about that movement so we know a bit more about you.
Yeah, the Psychologists for Future were founded in April 2019. When the Scientists for Future started their movement in Germany, we were watching them and we're like, shouldn't psychologists say something about societal change and behavioral change as well? And that's why we started.
Nice, excellent. And so what is it, a big grouping then? Is it you and a couple of mates in a room? How does it go?
Well, we have around 1,000 volunteers in Germany, and I guess that in Europe it's about 1,500 active volunteers, yes.
Okay. Well, really nice to meet you, Katarina, as well. Thank you. So, also, we have here Joeri Rogelj, who is Director of Research at the Grantham Institute and is a reader in climate science and policy, and a regular contributor to the all-important IPCC reports. And it's interesting, Joeri, that we've had this delay, haven't we? Like COP26 was going to be last year. Of course, it's been held back until just a few weeks' time. And in the meantime, of course, a very important and influential IPCC report came out, didn't it? So it's kind of, that must have changed the agenda, shifted the agenda, moved it on for this forthcoming COP.
Yeah, and actually also that was not really a given to start with. Also the IPCC was, of course, affected by COVID. Normally we meet a couple of times per year, all the lead authors of the IPCC, to actually make sure that we draft and pull these reports together. But actually it turns out that now, yes, there is this latest assessment report of the physical science of climate change that comes out before the COP, and in normal times it would come only afterwards. So this report provides a really stark warning. So let's see what the COP does in return.
Yeah, well, I mean, the starkness of the warning was striking, and, you know, I'm a journalist amongst other bits and pieces, and I was kind of blown away by the starkness of it. I hadn't really quite seen that magnitude coming along. And also, just before we move on, we're going to meet Alice just in a second. But can I ask a really rookie question here about what the IPCC is? So it's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But yeah, I hear about it in the news all the time. But if somebody said, what is the IPCC? I'm not sure I'd be able to say. So help me here.
Yeah, so the IPCC ultimately is the word panel. In that word, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, are 190 plus countries that are members of an intergovernmental organization that is tasked with assessing the best available science on climate change. So every 5, 6, 7 years, they put out big reports that are produced in a transparent, open, and inclusive way by top experts around the globe, very regionally diverse, and that ultimately get approved by all 190 plus countries in approval sessions.
Wow, okay, that's really helpful. Thank you, Joeri. So also here is Alice Bell, who's co-director at the climate change charity Possible. Also happens to be a former colleague of mine at Imperial College, and recently authored the book, Our Biggest Experiment, A History of the Climate Crisis. And in delving into that history, Alice, I wonder if we can talk about some of the language that we use around climate change. Do we call it global warming, climate change, the climate crisis? Yeah, and perhaps you can say a little bit about the history of how those terms have come and gone.
I mean, you can call it whatever you want, I think, really. I think one of the real problems we have with climate change is people are scared to talk about it, and they're scared to talk about it in the wrong way.
Yeah,
and there are people who then come and waggle their finger at you and go, oh, you should have said this thing instead of that thing. And I don't think that helps us express all of the really complicated feelings that we have about it. I mean, I think, we'll hear more about psychology later, and I'm not the psychologist on the panel, but I think just being able to express things in your own words is the important thing. So if you want to call it strawberry, you'd go ahead. It maybe isn't the best thing to call it because other people won't know what you're on about, but that's what, just call it what you want. But yeah, these phrases that can sometimes be, you get all these like conspiracy theories. Like someone told me that global warming as a phrase was invented by Al Gore to make us like feel that climate change was okay. And I was like, what? No. Global warming as a phrase was coined in 1975 by a climate scientist called Wallace Brooker. He was so annoyed later that he'd coined this phrase because people started using it and creating conspiracy theories around it that he gave a prize for anyone who could find another example of the use of the phrase before him so that he wouldn't have to take the claim of having coined it. And he coined this term in 1975 in a paper that he was writing where he was looking, by this point in the mid-70s, people had been aware that this thing we would now call the climate crisis was happening, that the burning of fossil fuels was heating the atmosphere, and this was causing a problem and an increasing danger for people on Earth. And they were studying it, they were learning more about it, like how much of a problem was it? Was cooling also a thing? How did the cooling and the warming, would they balance themselves out? What could we do about it? And they'd managed to go back looking at very long data sets, investigating things like tree rings. You've seen the tree ring at the Natural History Museum. If you haven't, go and see it. It's amazing. It's a massive tree ring, and you can count the rings. So corals have similar rings, and you can use things like this to look deep into the history of our atmosphere and of different climates over time. People had these long data sets, and he could see that if you go really far back in time through looking at things like coral rings, there's definitely a trend towards warming, not cooling. In the 70s, there was a bit of a kind of group of climate scientists that were known as the coolists and a group that were known as the warmists. And his paper in 1975 was like, no, it's warming. And that's why we say global warming. But people have been talking about this thing we call global warming for centuries, decades before then. It's certainly, this thing that we now see as like the fossil fuel problem was really kind of caught on in terms of things that people talked about seriously from the 1950s onwards. And then in recent years, we started saying the climate crisis. And I think I personally think that's a really good addition to our vocabulary. I think it helps us call out a very specific moment in time, this thing that we're living from, rather than other things like climate change is a much larger thing. It can include, climates very long ago, like thinking about how climates have changed from the dinosaurs to now, and all sorts of things that happen without whether humans are on this planet or not. But the climate crisis is more specifically this thing that humans have been doing to the planet for the last couple of hundred years, and is getting to be a crisis. And so I think for me, I found it really liberating to have that as an addition to my vocabulary.
Yeah, because I might have thought, well, the climate changes anyway, you know, so actually putting the word crisis on it gives it that focus. So that's good. I've realised in my excitement at the beginning I forgot to introduce myself properly. I did say I'm Gareth, but if anybody really cares, I'm a lecturer in science communication at Imperial College next door, and I host a weekly technology programme on the BBC World Service. So I do a lot of this, but it's usually in a studio, so it's nice to actually see people joining in this one. But that's enough about me. That's the most boring part of the discussion, because I want to go straight over, so I'm going to race over now back to Katerina. As somebody who, Katerina, you might be able to tell us a bit about the activist side of the science, the climate change, climate crisis discussion then. How activists have changed their strategies over time. So what have you seen? Because you've been involved with Greenpeace, haven't you, amongst others?
Yeah, I joined Greenpeace in 2009, so right before the COP. And I think that the way we talk about climate change in the activists NGO area has changed quite a lot. I think it started with just communicating science and trying to wake people up by talking about the science. And talking about climate change as the facts. And then with this bit of a depression in activism after the COP in Copenhagen that didn't lead to the outcomes that we expected or wanted, we had to switch the strategy because there was a bit of a climate fatigue. We already heard that word today. That disappointment kind of led to not wanting to talk about the topic anymore. And then I think NGOs switched to talking about other effects rather than just the climate effects of fossil fuel industries, like talking about the health effects of, for example, coal power plants, the lead emissions that cause bad health effects, or I don't know, other side effects of agriculture that are bad for biodiversity, but not focusing on the climate anymore, because they thought that probably talking about animal welfare would get people more engaged than just talking about scientific facts. And I think then leading up to the COP in Paris, and after discussions in the back of that disappointment after the COP in Copenhagen, we started to talk more about climate justice. So having that social perspective in as well, and that global justice perspective coming in as well, talking about the effects that climate change has on the global south, and all these aspects kind of allowed for a bigger alliance with the social movements as well. And I think that's why that discussion shifted a lot and also created more attention, really.
And so what about like the emergence of Extinction Rebellion, for instance, you know, which does seem to be, you know, this kind of activism really, you know, just coordinated, if I can put it this way, activism on steroids, you know, so what have you noticed with them and their tactics? And you must be interested in their activism, but also in their communication strategy, the tactics and the language that they use.
Well, actually, as a psychologist, I'm not the biggest fan of the way they do climate communications, really, because talking about extinction creates a lot of fear. And I think the alarming messaging that they use can activate some people who are then highly engaged, of course, but most of the people don't only need that prevention focus, so talking about what we want to not achieve, but they also need a promotion focus, so a way to go, or win-win communication that kind of motivates them to a brighter future. And talking about extinction and how everything's going to end is kind of depressing, really. And that's why I as a psychologist, wouldn't support the way they do communication. But I think Extinction Rebellion really is a very UK phenomena. It's not that big in Germany.
Okay.
Yeah, it totally is.
Well, that's interesting. So how UK-centric is it then? Is it just only, has anybody heard of it in France or the Netherlands, for instance? Or?
Oh, that I don't know. But we have Extinction Rebellion in Germany as well. It's just not as big as it is in the UK.
Okay. Right.
I think the Fridays for Future movement is bigger in Germany, and Extinction Rebellion is probably bigger in the UK. And I think that the very promising narrative that they have is that we need very small proportions of the population to come into action to actually make societal shifts happen, these social tipping points. And that's why they get people on board, because they feel I can finally do something about this. It's a promise of outcomes that they give, and that's why people do these drastic actions. But as a psychologist, I I would say that the promises they make don't really, I don't know, that doesn't really happen. In Germany we had 5,000 people on the streets blocking intersections, and people were like, okay, this is going to be that one big rebellion week, and then we blocked the streets and then everything's going to change, but it just didn't happen.
Right,
These people had criminal records afterwards, but nothing happened, and that's kind of led them into a very big disappointment in that organization as well. And I think that's something that we need to talk about in the NGOs when we speak to people about what they can do about climate change. Don't make false promises.
Right, that's it. So from a psychological point of view, this is real pop psychology here, but I'm just going to put it to you that, so, because it raises expectations, people get very excited, then nothing happens, and then disappointment sets in, and that feeds climate change fatigue like nothing else, I guess, then.
Yeah, I mean, transforming a society is a highly complex process.
Yeah.
And that needs so many different people in different areas doing their part. So you can't just promise with that one action everything's going to change.
And of course they say, but we can't wait that long. It's, you know, just people talking. It's nonsense. We just need activism. We need to get on with it. Would be their message, I suppose. And we can have, and are having a discussion about how effective that is. Because I just wonder, Joeri, like, as you know, on the panel on the IPCC and at the Grantham Institute, of course, it'd be very easy in this panel to cast you as the, you know, the logical, rational scientists. You know, whilst people are shouting on the streets outside, you're calmly in committee rooms looking at graphs and charts and data and so on. And we're going to move on to that, you know, the extent to which the scientists have the initiative in communicating these messages. But just tell us a bit about you as humanoid life forms in there. Like, how many of you are sitting there with Extinction Rebellion t-shirts or Greenpeace t-shirts on, and they've just been on a march, but now they're coming in and they're working as proper rational scientists? Just give us a profile here of who's around the table in these kinds of, in your research institute and indeed at these panels?
Well, I think scientists represent a cross-section of society in many cases. We have, well, as diverse as you want them to imagine. Of course, higher education still has quite a bit of a bias towards some parts of society, be it social class or gender, but ultimately, yes, we are people, and not at our core necessarily activists when we are doing our science, because that would undermine ultimately the credibility and the value of our work, and in that sense, I'm also not too much of a fan of the communication strategy of Extinction Rebellion, which kind of, in some cases, discredit mainstream science to look at some of individual papers that provide very drastic, very dramatic futures. I'm much more like the communication strategy of Fridays for Futures, which say, this is a problem, we are very concerned, listen to the science, and policymakers, decision makers, please do something about it. Which really puts the roles right. Science provides evidence, and as a scientist, I'm interested in providing evidence. As a citizen, I'm interested in more than just providing evidence, but that's outside my role. And that I don't do when I write a scientific study, that I do when I sit on panels, when I provide evidence for a certain case, or when I write reports.
Yeah. So, and I suppose that all of you in the scientific community working on this, you must care about climate change. Otherwise, you wouldn't have chosen that branch of science. But yeah, I see that, and maybe unfairly, I might just go to Alice in a moment to give perhaps your assessment, Alice, about the messaging from the activists versus the messaging from the scientists that we hear, and you'll know a lot about how those play out, and you'll get to the nub, I suppose, of this question. But just take us there. I think, Joeri, I'm just interested in your thoughts about the communication of your messages. So you come up with a report, and what the report is saying, of course, drastically matters to the future of us all and the planet, but inevitably, because, you know, it can be a bit dry. Is it your job to even worry about how it's communicated, or are you saying that I'm the data guy here and others can worry about communicating it? How does that play out?
Well, in the case of the IPCC reports, yes, we do worry a lot. And actually, something that is important to know is that these reports, when we write them, Well, they go through an elaborate process of peer review, but also of government review. Already during the writing of the process, governments provide feedback, and at the end, the summary document, which is 10, 20 pages printed, gets approved line by line. And that happens during a meeting, a 1 week long meeting. This time it was 2 weeks online. And there, governments help us rewrite sentences where we as scientists have to make sure that that sentence still remains scientifically accurate, but many of the government delegates help us to frame it in a way that makes sense, that communicates, that is actionable for them within their departments or within their wider outreach efforts. So we do think about it, and actually quite carefully, both in the language and also this assessment cycle, so the last 4 reports, in the design of the figures, where we really work with information designers that from the beginning, so that means over 3 years with lots of user testing, make sure that the visuals that we present, while being scientifically accurate, can also be understood by someone who is not necessarily looking at graphs every day and just interprets them immediately.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, all of us in the room, and certainly Alice and I remember that, that huge row over the UEA report and the way that graphs and charts were presented there. And so I'm going to ask you bluntly, Alice, so it's there in front of me. Who is leading the climate conversation? Is it the activists? Is it the scientists? I know it's a really complicated answer, but you've got a bit of time.
I think there's a lot of different, appropriately, there are a lot of different leaders and different people become more prominent at different times. I think, the thing that we heard earlier about kind of climate NGOs sort of avoiding talking about climate change, I think was a real trend for a long time. I think you can see that going back to the 80s and 90s. They talk about like a Save the Rainforest campaign or a Stop the Road campaign is often done because, partly at least, because of climate change. If an NGO is sitting there going, what are we going to campaign on? They'll often choose one of these things because of carbon emissions, but they won't necessarily say climate change, because for decades they felt that climate change wasn't the thing that was inspiring people. And people would be like, especially when I was a academic, so I could sit and like tell people that they were doing things wrong rather than having to actually get my hands dirty and do it myself. It's like, Greenpeace campaign again, they're talking about the polar bear, not climate change. Like, why do you keep avoiding saying the climate change word? But they were doing it because that was what resonated with audiences. And so you do the thing like what we'd call as co-benefits, which is like taking action on climate change not only tackles climate change, but has another benefit. So it might make you healthier or help you breathe easier, or, there's lots of other things that will make the world better as you tackle climate change. And you'll focus on those other things, and as a result, not talk about climate change. And so you've got lots of people kind of talking, like trying to talk about, to take action on climate change, but not talking about it. I think one of the other thing they did was they tried to do the positive thing. So the thing about saying, oh, we're all going to die, it's going to be terrible, it's just a disaster, does put people off. So a lot of the NGOs listen to that. They listen to the psychologists, particularly, I think, in the mid-noughties. There were several NGOs that were, right, okay, I'm going to try and not have this disaster narrative. I'm going to talk about the positives of taking action on climate change, how much better for the world doing this and that and the other will be. And helping people feel like they're doing something practical. But I think what happened was that we ignored that sense of pain and fear and anguish. And I think that's one of the reasons why XR emerged, because a lot of people out there wanted to just go and stand on the street and scream, because that emotion is still there in us and we need an outlet for it. And so I think one of the reasons we have had the emergence of XR, and to some extent the Fridays for the Future, was just lots of people kind of just not talking about climate change, or saying, oh, well, it'll be all right, we've got some solar panels, and doing some of the things that they thought was like good, like tested messaging work, and like they thought they were listening to the psychologists and stuff, but actually we hadn't done enough research on it, and we weren't really putting enough energies into it. I guess, maybe the simplest answer to the question of who is leading the climate conversation is not enough people have been taking enough leadership on it, and so we get these slightly dysfunctional things bubbling up, whether that's climate skepticism, a type of activism that for us, for one group or another, might not like, or just inaction. I think we all need, lots more people in society need to be taking more of a leadership role in it, really, is probably the diagnosis.
But are the climate change deniers getting more of a look in, or less of a look in there? Because that's one party we haven't spoken to, the activists and the scientists, but there's a big elephant in the room here, isn't there? So
well, no, I'd say they're a small elephant and always have been.
Oh,
They sometimes are quite good at thumping very loudly.
So maybe not even an elephant
well,
then.
Yeah,
there's a shrew in the room.
Climate scepticism has always been a very marginal hobby of the, in the UK. It's a very small percentage of people in the UK ever really engage with it. There were some of those small number of people were in places of power, so they got a little bit more sort of media coverage and stuff than they would necessarily have done. And also, it's the nature of journalism and the way in which we structure for everything from sort of BBC idea of balance to just wanting a good story is like, oh, this is awkward contrarian in the corner, I'll give them some space, which meant that they got more prominence than they probably should have or would have otherwise. And also there were lots of people deliberately trying to give them access. In places like America, I think you've seen larger amounts of it. There's different cultures around science in the US and other English-speaking countries. In Europe, generally, it just hasn't really taken hold so much. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And I think the other thing we need to bear in mind when we think about these things is that this thing we call climate skepticism can sometimes draw a lot of our attention and anger. But actually, there's a lot of forms of climate denial that, many of us, like everyday climate denial, where we just don't think about it while we book our airline tickets or things like that. There's lots of different types of climate denial that happen. Some of us need to, I need a day off at least a week where I don't think about climate change.
So is that the day you book all your flights then?
Yeah. Eat loads of meat, yeah. I think we need to think about all these different tactics for delay, some which are deliberate tactics, which are funded to stop us, to keep us using fossil fuels, and some which are just sort of the nature of it being difficult to create change, and cultural change is difficult. And we should be paying attention to those. But I mean, definitely, they peaked kind of in the 90s and noughties, even in the places where they had more power, they have less power. You can see kind of a gradual disintegration of their power. And you see the people who are trying to people who saw climate skepticism as a great tactic of delay, oil company, PR agencies or whatever, are moving on to other tactics of delay, whether it's greenwash or there's all sorts of different, they have a huge variety of different tactics. They're very good at these things, but you're seeing the power of the skeptics, it was never very strong, and it's definitely falling into the wayside.
Right. Okay, we'll take some audience questions in just a moment as well, but just to go there, I saw obviously like Katerina and Yuri, both, you were just nodding your heads there about that bit, and we'll move on from climate skepticism, not because I'm scared of talking about it, because there's just so many other things to get into, and I don't want people to say, oh, it was a great panel, but we just talked about the deniers the whole time. But you were nodding, and I just wondered what was going through your head as you were listening to Alice talking about, I suppose that kind of more nuanced idea. And just before we take your comment, Anna Stark, by the way, says, I agree, this is online, on one point, that we do have to follow a positive path to make people talk and learn about this very important issue. So that's what Anna says. And actually, Yuri, whilst you're considering what I was asking you about your head nodding, I do want to also see if you can factor into your answer this thought about, I suppose, the success of the climate change message, because it's on the agenda. There's so many panel discussions like this go on these days that wouldn't have done 10 years ago. When you've been in this research field for a long time, and you must have seen and reflected on how people, when you tell them what you do, will have gone from saying, well, what's all that about, to, oh, wow, so perhaps reflect on that for us.
Yeah, there has been a huge shift there, and also linking it back to the climate deniers. 10 years ago, we would be busy with rebutting deniers still. There would be an email in my inbox regularly saying, this is all not true and this kind of thing. Today, that's not the case. Actually, today I'm responding to emails saying, why aren't we taking into account all the tipping points and all the feedbacks which are going to see the world spin out of control, and we are going to be at 6 degrees warming by the end of the century. So I kind of have to dial it back, and there is a middle road there. Actually, it's not necessarily, the road is not necessarily in the middle, but there is an approach to evidence where we take a balanced approach to understanding that. And that's really what I'm experiencing now. And also simply in conversations with people, of course. You don't have to explain anymore what a climate scientist does. And also at university and students, we now have undergraduate courses that are across all of college, for example, where students from medical school, from engineering, maths, can take climate science and climate solutions as well as a undergraduate elective course. And it's hugely popular, so it really shows that it is there, people are interested, but people are not only interested in the problem, but also in the solutions, and there are many of them.
Yeah, and so it was really good that we're focusing, Katerina, on positivity there. And from a psychological perspective, of course, people speak these days about eco-anxiety. And I think quite a big discussion about whether the messages should be less about these alarming, terrible things that just make people really anxious and it freaks them out and they lose sleep over it. Or whether there's another argument that says that, well, we should all frankly be losing sleep over this because it's a huge existential crisis. You know, it's a bit of panic actually is probably quite a good thing at times.
Well, as a psychologist, I would say that it's important to be in contact with your feelings because that's what motivates us to act. So the problem, I would say, is that we're living in a bit of an emotion-phobic society where we're not used to talking about emotions and we're not used to regulating them and using them to transform them into action, and that's why we're not talking about the climate sometimes maybe. There's that buzzword of climate silence as well, because you don't want to spoil the party bringing up that topic, because we're not used to talking about things that are not easy to talk about and that probably make you anxious or angry or whatever. But all these climate emotions can be transformed into action, into positive change, if we know how to do that. And I think that's a very important message to bring across, that of course you can talk about the problem, and of course that will make you anxious or maybe angry about politicians who don't act, or I don't know, the economy not acting. But then what's the next step? And I think that's what we need to keep in mind when we talk about climate change, that we always need to talk about the solutions as well as talking about the problems, because we need a direction to direct that energy towards that these emotions create in us.
Yeah, and that's a message to activism as well, as you've already said about, you know, Extinction Rebellion perhaps going too far in the alarmist direction and not far enough in the, you know, activism for, yeah, let's just do this and sort this out positively together as a society. Well, as promised, let's have some questions. So put your hand up and you may come to the microphone. Yep, so Pete, straight out of the blocks there as well. I'll go to you, but I will get to you, Pete. So yes, just come on over and you can say your name and if you want, but you don't have to.
Thank you. I'm Ben, PhD at the University of Birmingham. My question's mostly for Joeri in the middle. It's about the mechanism of the IPCC, you know, writing periodic reports, conferences about those reports where we set targets, and then failure to meet those targets often. How effective do you think that mechanism is, and can you imagine a more effective mechanism?
Important question, Joeri.
Yeah, really good question. I think it's really important here to distinguish between what I think is really the success of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, providing reports that are read by probably almost every minister of environment around the world, that are being supported by all governments in the world, and then the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the political forum where action is taken, where targets are being set, where we had Kyoto Protocol targets in the 90s, where we now have the Paris Agreement and so on. So these are really two different fora that are closely linked. And the IPCC has influenced that political forum immensely. Just an example, the United Framework Convention was founded only after, or was agreed or adopted only after the first assessment report of the IPCC. The IPCC, the fourth and the fifth assessment report, kind of they led to the adoption of the 2-degree target, later to the Paris Agreement. So that evidence really plays a role in the political sphere and plays a kind of because of the process, because of the very elaborate process of the IPCC, it plays a very undeniably strong role. It can't be denied anymore in the negotiations. What then is done politically afterwards with it is another question, and IPCC is not involved in that. So I agree that I'm personally also quite disappointed with where we are at currently with climate action. But in terms of IPCC, I don't think that's necessarily a failure of the IPCC. It's truly a failure of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change.
Well, let's see. Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
So I've just written a book about the history of the climate crisis, and as part of that, I went back to reading about kind of the origins of the IPCC and how that happened in the mid-80s, alongside increasing calls for some kind of international convention. So yeah, Joeri's correct. We had like the IPCC, and then we had the UNFCCC. But one of the reasons we set up the IPCC was that we knew that the UNFCCC was coming, but that was vital because the people who were wanting to build a UN convention on climate change wanted to have really good scientific advice. And they modelled it in many ways. They were inspired by the Montreal Protocol on CFCs and protection of the ozone layer. And they saw how people like Bob Watson and other scientists in the mid-80s had managed to speak science to power and actually do something that doesn't always happen in science policy, which is be listened to. And they were like, well, could we do this for climate change? They knew it was going to be a much bigger challenge. They knew it wasn't going to be as simple as that, but they wanted to do something a bit like that. And I think that for all many problems and stumbling blocks, and there are faults in these processes as well, or there are different ways they could have been done, it has been vital to the UN process. And I think the IPCC is something that we should be really proud of, and I find like is outstanding, that it's a great human achievement. Like when I'm feeling depressed about climate change, I think, wow, we can put all these brains together to do something like that. At the same time, like one of the things that it's really stayed with me when I was reading about the kind of mid-80s period, were people having those first conversations between scientists that grew into the IPCC, and how one of the scientists involved was very clear that they had to stick just to the science, and his definition of sticking just to the science was to avoid saying anything that could even be looking in any way like a campaigner, and that was going to be the power of the IPCC, that you were playing this kind of role of a very strict scientist, where there were others who were like, no, I'm really terrified of this, and we need to talk about how scared we are, and bringing a bit more emotion into it. And they kind of fought, and I think the kind of more traditional idea of the scientist, who still is very, very, it is a different thing, the policy is a different thing from me, is the one that dominated. And maybe that was for the good. Maybe that is for the good, I don't know. We don't live in the universe where it went the other way, but I think that is one of the things that does sometimes trip it up, and I think is something that is changing a little bit recently.
And the role of scientific advisors and so on.
But it could have been different. We could have had a much more activist IPCC, but maybe it would have been thrown out years ago because of that. I don't know.
It would be, the process would be entirely different. Again, the IPCC ultimately are these 190 countries. So it's unimaginable that the end product would be approved and accepted by 190 countries if it's too activist. And that approval at the end is the power of the IPCC.
Yeah.
But it's also why it's very politically inherently. It is a political process, which is the other thing to remember.
No, sure. And in fact, Mike Wilkins online takes us into the question about the politics and says politicians are scared of an electoral backlash if they push the climate agenda too much. Does the panel agree? So let's have that one to each of you, actually. A quick comment from that, and then we'll go to Pete for a question. So, yeah, Joeri, because you picked up on Ben's question about the political aspect. So, is there a danger that politicians, that maybe it's not a great vote winner going on about climate change?
I think that was definitely a concern, and also the different kind of opinion barometers showed that climate change was not top priority on people's minds. It's changing very rapidly over the last 3-4 years, kind of since the Paris Agreement. I think the 1.5 degree special reports, then together with all the societal movements, really changed a lot in Europe, in particular, in the US actually as well, though the landscape is a bit different. Nowadays, a politician that doesn't speak about climate change in these areas, such a person now will face backlash. So ultimately, the political game is one where you do need to take into account, to some degree in democracies, what the public is saying. if it's not high enough on the agenda of people, yeah, then they can get away with it.
Yeah. Okay, Katerina, what do you see? Because you're from the Netherlands, I think.
I'm from Germany.
I do beg your pardon, my goodness, right, sorry.
It's all right.
So
I have a Dutch name.
Yeah, anyway, I'll stop squirming. Yeah, so tell me what you see in Germany, and you probably know a bit about the Netherlands and, of course, the UK.
Well, I guess in Germany we just had the federal elections, and they were climate elections, really. And I think we've already seen that in the European Parliament elections last time, that actually the climate topic is high ranking, and that all the politicians in Germany from every leading party were talking about the climate. They made promises which are probably not realistic, and they're probably not as good in their climate agenda as they promised to be, but there's nobody who's not talking about climate change anymore in the political
yeah. And just
area.
quickly, Alice, it sounds like you'd probably say, yeah, I agree, but if you don't, that could make it interesting. Let's see.
Yeah, I would exactly what Joeri said, in that it used to be and not the case. Two things though I'd say: there have been phases where this has happened before. George Bush Sr., the first President George Bush, campaigned in the 1988 election on he would say, one of the things he said on the campaign trail was, "You've heard about the greenhouse effect, well let me tell you about the White House effect." Like, this was not new. Thatcher talked about climate change and used it as part of political work. Like, this is not new. This may go away again. It's happened and gone away before. But definitely, I think it's really difficult for a politician to be taken seriously. However, then what happens is how you take those policies forward. So I think there are particularly some areas of climate action policies which politicians are understandably scared about, and if they tackle them badly, there will be backlash. We're already seeing fights about cars. I think we need to have systems for a transition that people can be part of, that isn't going to leave some people literally out in the cold or starving or out of a job. You know, if we it's one of the things that worries me about climate action is not just that we don't do it, but that we do it really badly, and that we create whole new areas or exacerbate further areas of social injustice because of that. And that, I mean, we're going to see stuff with boilers. We're already seeing that brewing. And there's people who are desperate to create a culture war on boilers because they know that that will stall climate action. And people like me who want to work on heat decarbonisation are like, well, this is one of the things I have to worry about. But also, if we just go pushing ahead, going, right, we're going to ban boilers, that will literally leave people in the cold. It will kill people. And understandably, people have relationships to their boilers. Weirdly, people love their boilers. Anyway, we need to tackle this well. People have understandably strong relationships with cars. The car industry has spent a century encouraging us through spent a huge amount of money on advertising to make us have relationships with cars. Our whole infrastructure is designed for us to travel around by cars. We need to do a lot of engineering work, infrastructure work, political work, social work, cultural work, whatever, before people are ready for those impacts. And that, I think, is the thing that maybe your questioner is actually getting at.
Yeah,
it's like,
I get it.
You know, they love talking about climate change, but they're not going to actually do anything in terms of this policy or that policy.
Yeah, no, sure. No, and I'm really glad because you brought in the industrial side as well, and that's yet another kind of form of messaging that we haven't discussed so far, so I'm glad you brought that in. So we've got my friend over there with the NYC t-shirt. We'll just take Pete, and then we'll go straight to you, and then we'll see which question we like, and we'll put it to the panel.
Thank you. Yeah, my name's Pete. I'm a student at Imperial, and I have a podcast with the Grantham Institute where I interview XR scientists. So, I mean, we were keen to separate scientists from activists. But I think that it's very important for those two to be together, and I want to know your opinions on that. So we've had evidence for hundreds of years that CO2 warms the atmosphere. The IPCC reports have had to change their language to be taken more seriously. But the reports don't provide change on their own, and disruptive activism, I would argue, is necessary to change the definition of business as usual. I know that a lot of the conversation about XR has been, we agree with their message, but not their methods. But I want to know what you think would be a better strategy.
Okay, yeah. So before we go to that, this next question, that is a good one, and I love your podcast, by the way. Is that the one where, for instance, climate scientists talk about? So a few of them speak very movingly. They just don't want to have a family because they just feel it's just, why would you bring a child into this kind of world, and also add to the carbon burden? Yeah, it's a great podcast. So Good stuff, right. And I found that very affecting, and that's one thing that I think informed me in my question to you, Joeri, about, what kind of people are you? I know you're emotional and you care about things, but, and you have to be rational as scientists, and I think your podcast helps us think in that way. Right, and enough of me blabbing on. What was I going to ask? Yeah, just about, if you can reflect a bit further on activism and the effect that it has or should have in a scientific context as well.
Yeah, I mean, if I got it right, so what can be done better? I mean, if you ask me, the evidence is damning enough. It doesn't need to be exaggerated. It doesn't need to be amplified. It needs to be taken serious. 2 degrees of warming is already something that we cannot really imagine. It's the end of key ecosystems on this planet. So why should we be talking about 4 degrees, 5 degrees? We will never get there because our society won't be functioning at that point to be creating the emissions. And that evidence is all there in IPCC reports or in the main papers. And if I then see a presentation by certain presentation where it said that you have IPCC reports, they are super conservative and biased conservatively, then you have single papers, but then if you talk to scientists in the pub, then you really know the real science. Well, that's not how science works. That's how conversations work, but not how science works. So I think the evidence is, take the evidence that is there, it's already sufficiently urgent to be acted upon.
Well, Catherine, let me ask you about that as well, as our kind of activist correspondent on the panel. Because I do take Joeri's point, 2 degrees, it's enough to keep me awake at night. And yet, but maybe people who are less scientifically literate might think, well, I wouldn't, if my room was 2 degrees warmer, I probably wouldn't notice. Some people might think, oh, it's only 2 degrees, it's not that bad, is it really? So yeah, just if you can pick up on that. So how emotional do we need to hear the scientists being in order to get these messages across?
Okay, that's a big question.
I know. I'd say, sorry if it's an unfair one. But,
well, I wouldn't say they need to be emotional. I think what we need to acknowledge is that scientists, of course, are humans as well, and they have feelings as well. And dealing with these kind of data is a hard thing to do every day. Like focusing probable collapse of our societies is not an easy thing to take on every day. And I think actually the climate anxiety debate around scientists. So talking about the feelings that you have when dealing with that science is, I think, a vital part, because people like to listen to stories. We like to listen to stories of people, and storytelling, really. That's what NGOs and activists do. And I think that maybe some scientists like to do storytelling as well. And I think that's not something that you should put in scientific papers.
Of course.
But maybe if you give a talk, you can talk about your emotions as well, and do a bit of storytelling around that. I don't know if you'd agree about that, but...
Yeah, so it doesn't undermine your science to own up to being a humanoid life form who cares about things and worries about things, yeah. And Joeri's nodding. Well, it's just to keep things moving on. Thanks, folks, by the way, that was great. Let's bring you up to the microphone, if you can, sir, and we'll hear your question.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
My name's Cameron. I was just going to ask, so of course this whole panel and discussion is about the way that the climate change movement, well, how it's been presented and the message. So it was already discussed about the doom and gloom and the more positive aspects. So I was asking about the urgency of it. This is a trend you're seeing on the rise, like Friday for Futures as an example. So how is that working? The idea that we are on the clock now and that we don't just have to act, we have to act now. What is the impact that that is having on the conversation?
Yeah, so how much is the urgency informing the debate? Really important question, Cameron, and who wants to take that?
I can?
Yeah, please do, Alice. Yeah,
say that
great.
I think that it's one of the things it's one of the reasons why climate conversations have been so rubbish for so long, because we've always felt that. It's not just that we have to act now, we have to have act yesterday.
Like, we had to act like before a lot of us were born. And we all know that. That clock, which sometimes activists like to project on big screens somewhere, is there in our hearts and in our minds all the time. And so nothing is good enough, that's really difficult. And I think that's one of the reasons why we don't just sit and talk about it and do it properly. And it means it's one of the many reasons why I think our conversations about climate change are clunky and ill-defined and ill-deformed and badly thought out. And it's a thing that we will have, those of us who work on climate change, is there. There is also, like, I was in Glasgow the other week, and they have projected on this big clock, this like climate clock. And me and my colleague just stood there in the street at like middle of the night, having come out of a gig that we'd been performing at, going, "Oh God, why is everyone so bad at climate comms?" Because it's just like telling us we're all going to die, we're all going to die, we're all going to die, and that doesn't help you have your conversation. It's reminding us that the time is up. Anyway, basically, I think those clocks are really like a bad idea, but they don't help. But they are all within us. We're all thinking about them all the time, and I think that's one of the things that's getting in the way of us taking action.
Yeah, lovely music, by the way. Joeri.
Yeah, I also think there's a big difference now between just 5 or 10. I don't know why we have the.
I'm not sure what they're trying to tell us with the music. Yeah, it sounds quite nice, faded under your voice, though. It's
just keep it going.
maybe, just so you know, in the booth, we're getting music on the fold-back speakers here. Yeah, they might not know it's playing. Well done for soldiering. What a pro you were, Alice. You were completely unflappable there. So what about you? Carry on, yes. It was lovely music, though. I'm not complaining.
Yeah, so on the urgency, actually, there is also a big difference between where we were like 10 years ago when we were discussing